This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News 9. English news as it should be.
Very good morning. You're watching News 9. I'm Karthik Malhotra, and we've got a packed show with all the international as well as Indian stories on markets, business and economy. But on the show today, Adani and Ambani are tying up and fueling up a new partnership. How disruptive will it be for the energy sector? We'll bring you that on the show this morning. Also on the show, what can be best described as a choppy week? Will Thursday see the Sensex soar past the 83,000 levels? Well, Avnash Gorakshakar will be here on the show to unpack all that for you. You're watching Morning Brief at 9. This is Morning Brief at 9. First up, let's bring you all the headlines that we're tracking for you this Thursday morning. U.S. President Donald Trump once again claims he prevented nuclear war between India and Pakistan through trade-linked calls, speaking at NATO Summit in The Hague. Mukesh Ambani and Gautam Adani announced strategic partnership to jointly expand fuel retail network across India through Jio-bp and Adani Total Gas Partnership. Meanwhile, Russia hopes for early revival of RIC dialogue amid improving India-China ties, says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Meanwhile, U.S India Business Council launches Innovation Bridge at Golden Jubilee Summit in Bengaluru, highlighting collaboration in artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, biotech and startups to boost global innovation leadership. In policy news, the PLI schemes drive as much as 1.76 lakh crore rupees in investments and generate more than 16.5 lakh crore rupees in sales. Over 12 lakh jobs created across 14 sectors. Pharma sector emerges the top performer. Market regulator SEBI has imposed a 25 lakh rupee fine on BSE for unequal access to corporate disclosures and inaction against brokers with frequent trade modifications. Taiwanese firm Foxconn secures a $2.2 billion investment approval for India and US to build new iPhone factory and data center equipment unit. Prada faces backlash for a 1.2 lakh rupee sandal resembling the Kolhapuri Chappal with no credit to Indian artisans or acknowledgement of cultural origins. And good news coming in for the class 10 students from 2026 CBSE 10th standard students can take board exams twice a year with February attempt mandatory and May optional to score improvement. A top story this morning, US President Donald Trump has once again claimed that he was the one who stopped a potential nuclear war between India and Pakistan. Speaking at the NATO summit in The Hague, Trump said a series of tough trade-linked phone calls with both sides is what cooled tempers and stopped escalation. Listen in.
People would have any idea. Vladimir Putin has been more difficult. Frankly, I had some problems with Zelensky. You may have read about him. And it's been more difficult than other wars. I mean, look, we just ended a war in 12 days that was simmering for 30 years, frankly. We ended Rwanda and the Congo. It's coming to sign the documents. We've already signed basic documents, but they're coming, I think, to the White House on Friday. We ended Serbia was going to go at it. But maybe the most important of all, India and Pakistan. And that wasn't whether or not they may someday have nukes like we're talking about in the Middle East, like we're talking about with Israel and Iran. This is they have nuclear weapons. I ended that with a series of phone calls on trade. I said, look, if you're going to go fighting each other, it was getting very bad. You know how bad that last attack was. It was really bad. If you're going to go fighting each other, we're not doing any trade deal. No, you have to do a trade deal. They said, we're not doing any trade deal. And in fact, I had the general, who was very impressive. The general from Pakistan was in my office last week. Prime Minister Modi is a great friend of mine. He's a great gentleman. He's a great man. And I got them to reason. I said, we're not doing a trade deal if you're going to fight. And if you're going to fight each other, we're not doing a trade deal. And you know what? They said, no, I want to do the trade deal. We stopped the nuclear work.
And just to put on record, India continues to deny Trump's intervention, stating that DGMO-level calls were in fact initiated by Pakistan itself. Well, moving on now, in a major move, Mukesh Ambani and Gautam Adani, the country's two biggest business tycoons, have joined hands as Reliance Jio's BP and Adani Total Gas announced a strategic partnership on Wednesday to collaborate on fuel retailing across their networks. The alliance, the second after Reliance acquired a stake in an Adani power project last year, aims to enhance access to high-quality fuels and enhance the auto fuel retail experience for Indian consumers. As part of the deal, select Adani fuel outlets will begin selling Jio-bp's high-performance petrol and diesel, while CNG units from Adani Total Gas will be installed at Jio-bp stations. Now, both current and future outlets of the partners are covered under this agreement, which combines Adani's 650 plus CNG stations with Jio-bp's network of 2,000 fuel stations. The joint venture brings together major global players too, with Adani Total Gas backed by France's Total Energy and Jio-bp, a collaboration between Reliance Industries and British oil giant BP. The partnership sent stock prices edging up, with RIL rising 1.19% in trade and Adani Total Gas gaining almost 0.33% in trade on Wednesday. In another major development, Russia has expressed hope for the revival of the Russia-India-China dialogue. The RIC dialogue, a key strategic trilateral grouping that has been inactive since the Galvan Valley clash in the year 2020. Now, speaking at the Primakov readings in Moscow, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he expects the RIC Troika to resume soon, citing improving ties between New Delhi and Beijing. Lavrov highlighted Russia's long-standing strategic partnership with India and acknowledged that meetings were halted due to both the COVID-19 pandemic and the border escalation between India and China. However, with disengagement from friction points like Demchok and Depsang, Lavrov said the path is clearing for renewed talks now. He also emphasized that Russia-China ties remain a pillar of stability across the vast Eurasian region as global diplomacy continues to shift in a multipolar world. And Bengaluru has emerged as a key hub for global innovation with the launch of the U.S. India Innovation Bridge as the India-U.S. Business Council's Golden Jubilee Summit kicked off in the city yesterday. Now, the sharp focus on next-generation technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology and startup ecosystems. The summit highlighted India's crucial role in shaping the future of global technology and policy. Karnataka's IT Minister Priyank Hague, delivering the keynote address, emphasized the state's readiness to lead global innovation, calling the U.S. India tech partnership a powerful catalyst for growth. A key highlight was the unveiling of the Innovation Bridge developed in partnership with Zinnov Consulting. The partnership and the platform aims to transform India's Global Capability Centers, or GCCs, into hubs of value creation by fostering cross-border collaboration, R&D, policy alignment and skill development to power the next wave of global innovation. India's production-linked incentives, or PLI schemes, are delivering strong results, with the government reporting a massive boost in manufacturing, investment and exports across key sectors. Now, as of March 2025, the data suggests that the scheme has attracted investments worth 1.76 lakh crore rupees and generated over 16.5 lakh crore rupees in sales, while creating more than 12 lakh jobs. This according to the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now, spread across 14 strategic sectors from electronics and telecom to pharma, textiles and drones, The initiative aims to strengthen domestic production and reduce import dependence. Now, so far, over 21,500 crore rupees in incentives have been disbursed under 12 of these 14 sectors. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, during a high-level review meeting, emphasized the need to focus on India's areas of natural strength and resolve infrastructure and manpower challenges. He urged ministries to prioritize quality in skilling over sheer quantity and to lay out a 5-year roadmap for investment and disbursement strategies. Now, the pharmaceutical sector stood out as the top performer, registering sales of 2.66 lakh crore rupees, which included exports of 1.7 lakh crore rupees over the last 3 years. Capital market regulator SEBI on Wednesday slapped a 25 lakh rupee penalty on BSE for failing to provide equal access to corporate disclosures for all stakeholders and take action against brokers with frequent modifications during trades. In a 45-page order, SEBI found that BSE's system architecture allowed its paid clients and internal listing compliance monitoring or LCM team to access corporate announcements before the same were made public through its website, resulting in a breach of norms. The regulator also observed that the data dissemination process lacked safeguards to ensure simultaneous and equal access to all stakeholders, which is critical to maintaining market integrity and preventing unfair information advantage. Taiwanese electronics giant Foxconn is ramping up its global expansion with fresh government approvals to invest over $2.2 billion in India and the United States. A large portion of the funding, which is around $1.5 billion, will flow into Foxconn's Singapore arm, which will invest it in Yuzhan Technology India Private Limited. This investment will be used to set up a new iPhone manufacturing facility in India, further strengthening the country's growing role in Apple's global supply chain. Foxconn also received approval to invest as much as $735 million in the United States to launch a new company, Project ETA, which will focus on data center equipment as well as server assembly. And moving on now to a story that's been creating buzz across all social media platforms. Now, would you pay as much as 1.2 lakh rupees for a pair of Kolhapuri Chappals? Well, that sounds bizarre, right? But that is the price tag that luxury fashion house Prada has put on what it's calling leather flat sandals. But they look exactly like the traditional Indian Kolhapuri Chappals. At Prada's Spring-Summer 2026 show in Milan, the footwear appeared in at least 7 runway looks, which replicates with the Kolhapuri design. Yet, what's missing is any acknowledgement of the Indian origins or the artisans behind the craft. The sandals are reportedly priced at 1.16 lakh rupees, and critics say this is another example of cultural appropriation. The global fashion brands borrow traditional designs without credit or compensation to their original creators. Now, the backlash online has been massive, with many calling out the brand for both the exorbitant pricing and the lack of cultural recognition. And good news coming in for class 10 students, at least those who would qualify to sit for the board examinations next year, the year 2026. And this is a major move to ease exam pressure. The CBSE board will now allow class 10 students to take exams not once but twice a year starting next year, that's 2026. As per the new rules, the first attempt in February will be mandatory for all students of class 10th, while the second phase in May will be optional, allowing students a chance to improve their scores. CBSE approved the changes in line with the National Education Policy, which emphasizes student-friendly assessments. The CBSE examination controller confirmed that results for the February exam will be declared in the month of April, while May exam results will follow in the month of June. Students will be allowed to improve marks in up to 3 subjects, including science, math, social science, as well as languages. However, Internal assessments will be conducted only once during the academic year. Time for a short break right now, but coming up on the other side, will Sensex breach the 83,000 levels? Avinash Gorakshakar will be here to unpack that for you, because this has been, at least up until yesterday, what can be best described as a choppy week. Remember, markets ended sharply higher yesterday. Will that momentum continue today? That's coming up on the show.
देखना इन आंखों को अभी एक ख्वाब बाकी है, सुननी इस दुनिया को मेरी खामोशी की आवाज बाकी है। समझते थे जिसे वो मुकाम मेरा, होना वहां से मेरा आगाज बाकी है। टाटा मोटर्स प्रस्तुत करता है अब मेरी बारी TV9 नेटवर्क के साथ। कर लीजिए सपनों को साकार करने की तैयारी। कहेंगे आप भी जल्द, अब मेरी बारी।
If I were to ask you, we are discussing marketing and campaigns and brand and campaigns. What is that one classic advertisement or a brand campaign or a marketing initiative that sort of inspires you, that stayed with you, that and continues to inspire you in your everyday work?
So in the consumer space, quite a few of them.
Okay, but I'm asking for the ones that you love the most.
Well, I'm going to talk about three of them.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
First one, of course, is Pidilite. Okay, the Fevicol ads.
Okay.
I really love them. Then, of course, there is Amul, which has stood the test of time over the years. Something that you call moment marketing today. They mastered it and they have done it for decades.
Before it was called moment marketing.
Before it was called moment marketing. And of course, in the B2B space, I think my gold standard is an ad or a commercial from the 1980s. It was a Tata Steel campaign which said, we also make steel.
What began as a day of celebration turned into a tragedy. The High Court has stepped in and political blame game has ensued. Why is it so difficult in Indian society to say no, mistake has been made? This timeline is going to make things very clear. This was very much avoidable. Unparalleled scene, unimaginable to watch. America and Europe are reaping what they have sown. Is this the new frontier of the American politics?
Welcome back. You're watching News 9. Let's begin with a market update. Let's start first with the United States. Well, U.S. markets took a breather on Wednesday following a two-day rally as traders kept an eye on a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Meanwhile, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell delivered a second round of congressional testimony, holding investor attention. Now, tech powerhouse Nvidia soared to new heights, closing over 4% higher and reaching a market cap of $3.75 trillion, officially the most valuable company on the planet. Details in this next report.
U.S. stocks took a breather on Wednesday, with the Dow dipping 0.25%, the S&P 500 ending flat, and the Nasdaq ticking up about 0.33%. Stocks had rallied for 2 days on the tenuous ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Investors also parsed 2 days of congressional testimony from Fed Chair Jerome Powell, which concluded on Wednesday. Speaking to the Senate Banking Committee, Powell reiterated that the Fed would wait to cut interest rates until the inflationary effects of President Donald Trump's tariffs are better known. That could take months, said Brad Bernstein, managing director at UBS Private Wealth Management.
Are tariffs going to be inflationary or not is a great question. And that is what the Fed is waiting on. They need a couple more months of data before they feel comfortable starting to cut interest rates, which is why markets and UBS believe they'll start cutting in September. But what we think, and what several of the Fed members have come out and said, there may be a one-time price reset in the markets, but it won't be long-term inflationary, just like we saw in Trump 1 in his first term.
Stocks on the move Wednesday included Nvidia, which touched a record high, closing up more than 4%. The AI darling's market value is now $3.75 trillion, making it the world's most valuable company. Tesla shares fell nearly 4% as the EV maker's European sales slumped for a fifth straight month. And U.S.-listed shares of BlackBerry jumped 12.5% on the heels of its revenue forecast hike. Once known for its smartphones, BlackBerry now sees growing demand for its cybersecurity services amid growing online crimes.
And well, despite the commentary coming in from Fed Chair Jerome Powell that interest rates in US would be higher for longer, unlikely to be cut before September, the markets in the US have held off fairly fine given the ceasefire, fragile as it may seem, between Israel and Iran. Meanwhile, the reaction on Asian markets has been fairly mixed, with the Hang Seng falling in trade today, while other indices actually inching up a little sharper. That's what you have on the screens. Hang Seng, Hong Kong's stock index, has slumped about 0.5 percentage point in trade this morning, but better news coming in from Taiwan, as the TAIEX has gained about 1/5 percentage point in early trade. We also got news coming in of just a marginal increase in China's Shanghai Composite Index. Remember, this was one of the rare indices which was in the red yesterday, along with Japan, the Nikkei 225. And Nikkei 225, in fact, is registering handsome gains in trade this morning, up by more than 1 percentage point. The biggest beating for some reason is coming from South Korea, as the Kospi is down more than 2% in trade this morning. We'll try and get you answers to what's really the mood in Asian markets and why we are seeing this divergence, as Avinash Gorakshakar will be joining us shortly. Meanwhile, let's shift focus now to Indian markets, and Indian markets have opened absolutely flat. Well, remember, yesterday saw the Sensex rally more than 600 points, and this comes after another day when the Sensex had, after seeing high gains, moderated slightly, ending up about 150 points higher on Tuesday. But this morning, the tone on Sensex and Nifty seems to be just about in the flattish to marginally higher territory. We've got the Sensex now inching closer to that 83,000 levels, up about 0.2% in trade this morning. Meanwhile, Nifty 50 is holding strong above the 25,300 levels. The action on the small cap space seems to be fairly encouraging this morning. The small cap 100 index is up about 0.5 percentage point. And given the fragile ceasefire that we've been talking about, volatility, the fear index in Indian markets has now lowered to about 12.7 levels. Let's look at the Nifty 50 heat map and try and make sense of where these little gains that we're seeing this morning are coming from. And it seems to be the non-energy minerals, the cement stocks, the steel stocks, which are in great demand this morning. In fact, you've got Tata Steel up about 1.3%. Similar news coming in from JSW Steel also, which is up about 1.3% in trade. Meanwhile, Bharti Airtel is also trading higher than 1% this morning. The IT pack seems to be a little mixed this morning, despite the Nasdaq inching higher yesterday. The knock-on effect seems to be lacking in the IT stocks this morning. Remember, Nvidia had crossed more than 4% on the Nasdaq yesterday on demand of its artificial intelligence chips. In fact, it now happens to be the most valuable company on the planet. Meanwhile, not too much positivity seen on the Indian IT stocks this morning, with Infosys up about 0.2%, Tech Mahindra on the other hand declining, and TCS more or less flat. Well, we have a special guest joining us this morning. Avinash Gorakshakar is here to unpack all this for us. Avinash, good morning. Let me start first with US markets. In fact, the Nasdaq inched higher yesterday. Nvidia now happens to be the darling once again of investors. That stock was up about more than 4% yesterday. Valuation of the company at about $3.75 trillion. That's a mammoth valuation. Do you think at a time like this, when you know that all trade policies are going to favor the United States, does it make sense for Indian investors to park a little bit of money on international bourses, especially in Wall Street?
Yeah, good morning, Karthik. See, my guess is that Media, of course, reported good, strong numbers yesterday, and I think the markets were pleasantly surprised that earnings growth as well as the overall performance was much better than what the street expected. Coming to your question, whether Indian investors could invest in US stocks, I think they could definitely look at putting a little amount of their capital here. But I think one needs to understand that here basically allocations have to be done in reasonable quantities, and most importantly, you need to monitor these companies on a regular basis. My sense is that Indian investors were not comfortable with, I think, tracking global kind of news flows and the kind of environment that the US market follows. I think should not do that. But yes, somebody who has already invested heavily in the Indian market, has got a large amount of liquidity available, could definitely try out investing in ETFs or maybe direct companies, depending upon the risk profile. But I think net as you were mentioning on the Indian market, Karthik, my sense is that yesterday we saw a good rally. So today I think it would be a time for a little more consolidation. At least the near term kind of tailwinds seem to be quite positive, because now the Iran-Israel war is over. I think things are getting back to normal, and I think markets would definitely now look at penciling the April to June, kind of quarterly numbers, which would now be expected very soon, because once we have June getting over, I think again the markets would start discounting how the first quarter of FY26 is going to pan out, specifically for rate sensitive, because the NBFCs, the banks, most of the financial intermediaries, according to me, could be a big beneficiary now going forward.
Well, of course, they could be the beneficiaries, but in fact, we are seeing trade inch up higher. In fact, the markets opened almost flat, but now we're seeing that Sensex and Nifty are both up about 0.3% or so. Meanwhile, I think what seems to be driving the momentum on Nifty 50 this morning, Avinash, seems to be the cement and steel stocks. Tata Steel is up about 1.4%, JSW Steel up almost 1.5%, and even the cement stocks are holding massive gains this morning. What seems to be the trigger for that, given the fact that we are still just a few days away from tariffs to kick in, especially on the steel sector, which is likely to be hit?
No, I think my guess is, Karthik, tariffs, I think the scare which came on April 2nd is now completely out of the market. I would not be surprised that it would be a conducive policy, because clearly on the metal side, we don't know what is the kind of, US tariffs which are going to come in. But I think clearly, on sectors like IT, pharma, auto components, I think what the markets initially expected was a little bit of a harsh treatment from the US. But I think looking at the fact that Donald Trump is looking at India as a very big market for US products and services, definitely I think say around August or maybe little around September, I think the entire clarity on US India tariffs would be more or less in place, and I think that has already been factored into the markets. So to that extent, I think globally, whichever sectors are positioned like metals or pharma or auto components or IT, these could start moving up, because these were beaten down also very badly. So I think the markets have now penciling in a normal growth once September happens, and I think the second half is expected to be much better than the first half for all these globally positioned companies. Of course, domestic facing companies will also do well, but I think the markets are now looking at those sectors which were beaten down earlier very badly, and that is where the bounce is coming in today.
But the sectors that were beaten down also include the IT sector, Avinash, and that sector is finding it much harder than all other sectors to bounce back. In fact, despite NASDAQ inching higher yesterday and consistently for 2 days, we are seeing that the IT sector is facing tremendous stress this morning. TCS is down almost 0.4%. Infosys is down about a third of a percentage point. All this coming in complete divergence with what we are seeing on NASDAQ, and not just today. This is a new trend that seems to be emerging.
No, I think, my guess is that IT companies could show better numbers, only from the second half. The first and the second quarter is unlikely to show any major big fireworks. Most important is, you got to understand that even as of now, the large client order wins have not yet come in for most of the larger IT companies. In fact, there has been some delay. And most importantly, only when we see the commentary and the order wins getting in more stronger and getting more accelerated, at that point of time, the markets would get a sense that growth is coming back. See, most of these companies, Karthik, have got very strong balance sheets. They're sitting on reasonably good order books. But I think what the market wants is growth. And I think this growth has yet not percolated down. So, you could probably look at companies like Persistent, KPIT, in the larger caps, you're positive on TCS. But I think for a bigger re-rating trigger, you'll have to wait post-September. I think that would be a time when one could see actual news flows and, data points to justify the rise. But as of now, I think these companies are going to remain in a very soft and a sideways zone.
Right. Post-September, again, of course, the assumption being that the US Fed will go ahead and cut those interest rates, and that fight between Donald Trump and Fed Chair Jerome Powell would hopefully come to an end in favor of the India IT story. Meanwhile, I also want to understand from you, Avinash, we've seen massive volatility for the last 15 odd days ever since the Israel-Iran conflict broke out in the energy stocks. And that seems to, at least this morning from what we are seeing on the charts, that seems to have reduced a little. And the energy sector is now responding more favorably with fewer swings that we were seeing when the conflict was on. Now, let's assume that this ceasefire holds, at least for the foreseeable future, Avinash. What's the view on energy stocks from here?
So I think clearly with the cessation of the war between Iran and Israel, I think clearly you're going to see a lot of action on the oil marketing companies. Many companies which are basically, having raw materials as a form of either direct crude or their derivatives like aviation, lubricant companies, chemical companies, carbon black paint companies, these could possibly start showing a reasonably good bounce. In fact, once the announcement came in, you saw that upstream companies like ONGC, Salan Exploration, Oil India were beaten down. But on the other hand, oil marketing companies like BPCL, HPCL, IOC could show a strong bounce back. So I think it's a good kind of development because, for us, crude is a very important variable in our trade deficit. And most importantly, lower crude price also indicates a lower inflation. So I think you're going to see all the crude oil beneficiaries definitely perking up slowly and steadily. Of course, the numbers for April to June and then the second quarter, July to September, will be very important. And how soon, this crude price stabilizes, because, it's moved up from 65 to almost $79, $80 a barrel. So I think if the war does not continue and there are no further geopolitical kind of developments, then I think you could expect a decent kind of, at least a couple of quarters for these companies, specifically the oil marketing companies where we are structurally positive.
All right. You did mention inflation-sensitive sector. I will come to FMCG stocks in just a bit. But Avinash, I also want to understand from you what happens now to India's defense stocks. Again, anytime there's a global conflict, the defense sector seems to be doing well. Now that the conflict has eased, we are still seeing that HAL, BEL, companies which are well entrenched in the defense ecosystem are seeing great gains in trade. We saw this yesterday. We are seeing this play out today as well. I want to understand, in the context of NATO, in the context of Europe really increasing their defense budget, and estimates suggest that over time they may actually take it up to about 5% of their respective GDPs. Are we likely to see more flow of business to Indian firms like HAL?
Yeah, I think Karthik, understand one thing, that when the war cessation was announced, immediately we saw some selling wave in defense stocks because a lot of built-up had happened in defense stock companies. Normally what happens is that whenever there is a war in any part of the world, obviously defense companies are in demand. People expect that their business grows. But I think you must also understand that defense companies also get the benefit of replenishment of existing orders, not only from their domestic client, but even export kind of customers. And I think you're right that now globally, these kind of situations are getting regularly repeated. First, it started with Russia, Ukraine, then Israel, Iran. My sense is that Europe, as you rightly pointed out, is also arming itself quite considerably. And going forward, now Indian companies are well positioned to cater to even overseas markets. So I think if you talk about HAL or you talk about Bharat Electronics, Bharat Dynamics, these are all companies which are now well positioned to tap the export market also. So I think, these are companies which I think you should never see on a quarter-to-quarter basis, Karthik, because there's always going to be some lumpy growth and lumpy, kind of development quarter on quarter. But over the next, say, 2 years, these companies are very well positioned to capture that growth. and the domestic market is growing by leaps and bounds. The government is encouraging the Make in India policy. So I think, investors should look at these companies from a slightly longer term perspective and not from a short term angle.
All right, look at defense stocks from a long-term perspective, not short-term. That's the view coming in on defense stocks by Avinash Karakshakar. Avinash, I want to now come to inflation-sensitive sectors, the FMCG sector especially. And again, like you mentioned, the real merit in looking at these stocks could perhaps come given the inflation and overall what happens in the US and whether or not India imports inflation from the US. But FMCG stocks, again, looking good in trade this morning. And again, this has been one sector which is fairly susceptible to volatility, at least not in the short term, but in the inflation-linked data as that gets released medium, month on month. So we are seeing Nestle India is up about 0.76% in trade this morning. Tata Consumer, on the other hand, is inching closer to 1% gain. What do we make of FMCG stocks, and those who are holding these stocks, what should their trading strategy be?
My guess is that this is going to be a good year for FMCG sector, largely because, rural India, which was, lying low for a considerable amount of time. This year, I think monsoons have arrived before time. And I think once rural demand picks up, you're going to see a lot of these FMCG companies benefit because a considerable amount of demand shift is actually coming from the rural markets. And I think once rural markets start getting better, you're going to see volume growth getting better. I think probably, in some companies, it could be closer to double digit. And I think, obviously with a better agri production kind of, lineup, most importantly, most of these rural customers would be having decent spending power. And plus, my sense is the government would also encourage, this kind of buy. I would say that, companies like Dabur, Hindustan Lever, typically, even companies like Britannia, or for that reason, even a Godrej consumer products look quite interesting because, these have been beaten down considerably from their highs. I think once you get a clear indication in maybe the April to June quarter on the volume growth, on the management commentary, the second quarter could be a kicker quarter because I think, most of the improvement would be clearly visible in the July to September quarter. But I think, yes, if inflation is under control, then I think that would also help these companies in keeping their prices low because a rise in inflation actually increases their selling price and their, demand kind of trend. So net, I think things are looking nice. We will have to see numbers for April to June and July to September, Karthik. But at least, these companies, if there is any decline or maybe a small correction, I think investors should actually look at this sector now a little more positively.
All right. Well, of course, the July quarter and the September quarter are going to be crucial to look at that data. Finally, before I let you go, Avinash, I want to just get a sense of what's really happening in rest of Asia because Asia seems to be fairly mixed in trade this morning. We are seeing the Japanese Nikkei 225 is down more than 2% in trade this morning. So it's the case with Hong Kong, and specifically looking at Japan, the consumer durables segment, which is one of the heavyweight sector for Japan stock markets, are all in the red this morning. No news really either on tariffs or any other export related issues that have come out, but we are seeing Japan is really reeling under pain this morning with the Nikkei 225 down about more than 2%. In fact, stocks like Toyota as well as Honda are taking a massive beating this morning. What's happening globally? Why is Asia so mixed in its response this morning, Avinash?
I think very difficult to actually pinpoint the reason, Karthik. But I think clearly, there are growth concerns that if tariffs do come in and if they do come, that is going to further, increase the pain for these economies. I think growth in these economies are missing. I think if you look at Japan, clearly, I think for the last 10, 15 years, we have not seen this economy going anywhere. So my sense is that, yes, there could be some increased fear that if tariffs are not going to be favorable, that is further going to be a kind of a negative for their domestic economies. And most of these economies are looking outwards. They are looking at export markets like India to, propel their growth. So I think my sense is that some news in the pipeline might be there. And that's the reason you're seeing that, despite a good US market, I think today the Asian markets are not doing well. Some news flow should definitely kick in, and that could be the near-term reason for this.
All right, news flow should kick in, and that is all we all wait for every day. Well, thank you so much, Avinash Karakshakar, for your inputs and for being here with us this Thursday morning with all those updates. And time for a short break, but before that, a quick look at all the global stories that we're tracking for you this morning. U.S. President Donald Trump claims victory at the NATO summit in The Hague as member nations agree to increase defense spending to 3.5% of GDP by 2035, with another 1.5% going towards broader security efforts, taking up the total outlay to 5% as demanded by Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Trump says he will negotiate directly with Spain after the country refuses to meet NATO's defense spending goals. Trump warns Spain will have to pay double in trade tariffs. And at the NATO forum, US President Donald Trump also says Russian President Vladimir Putin may have ambitions beyond Ukraine, reveals he urged Putin to settle the war during a recent phone call. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky meets US President Trump behind closed doors during the NATO summit. Trump says the 50-minute talk couldn't be nicer. Trump confirms the US plans to hold nuclear talks with Iran next week as global pressure mounts following recent military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Trump also urges Israel to drop Prime Minister Netanyahu's corruption trial, calling these charges a witch hunt for Israel's great hero. Fed Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says Donald Trump's tariff plan complicates inflation forecasting. Trump fires back, says he's considering Powell's replacement. Meanwhile, Tesla's new car sales in Europe fall nearly 28% in the month of May, even as overall EV sales in the region surge. At least 16 people died during anti-government protests in Kenya as public anger over police brutality and past tax hikes fuels fresh unrest. All these stories on the other side of the break. You're watching Morning Brief at 9.
Who am I?
Nobody can crack that mystery.
There is a certain expectation of me.
That's the only contradiction.
Life itself is stranger than fiction.
I was a perfectly normal person born in an abnormal world.
I really didn't understand why is it different.
Just imagine a child who is bullied every day.
Boys school में कुछ लड़का लोग मेरे साथ sexual abuse किए.
मुझे तेरे बारे में सब पता है और मैं तेरा रेप कर लूँगा.
You also start to stigmatize.
अरे ये तो time pass है.
Sex doesn't come in the picture. Sex comes very late. Then there are man-made narratives.
Why do you walk like that? Why do you sway so much? So you can understand the trauma of a person who's trapped in a wrong body.
But nothing can bind life.
You have to reclaim the lost position. We fought for more than 10 years.
Today I'm the mother of the industry.
I'm a first transgender member judge.
You can't walk in everybody's shoes.
This is what I'm comfortable with. They just are what they are.
You become the light yourself.
That is the change that I was looking for.
When I recognize myself, it's a small story, but it's an interesting one.
Back, you're watching News 9. Let's get you all the action that's unfolding at The Hague, where the NATO summit is on. At the NATO summit in The Hague, US President Donald Trump declared victory after members agreed to finally raise defense spending to 3.5% of GDP by the year 2035, with an additional 1.5% towards broader security efforts. Now, Trump called the deal a fantastic and monumental win for the US and reaffirmed his country's commitment to protect its European allies. He also spoke about a recent call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where he pushed for a settlement to the conflict in Ukraine, adding that Putin may have ambitions beyond Ukraine. Listen in.
He has said that Mr. Putin has territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine. Do you view that in the same way?
Possible. I mean, it's possible. I know one thing, he'd like to settle. He'd like to get out of this thing. It's a mess for him. He called the other day. He said, can I help you with Iran? I said, no, you can help me with Russia. You help me get a settlement with you, with Russia. And I think we're going to be doing that. Vladimir Putin really has to end that war. People are dying at levels that people haven't seen before for a long time.
Well, at the summit, Trump also announced that he will handle Spain's defense contributions personally, criticizing the country for falling short of committing to NATO's 5% GDP spending target on defense. He warned that Spain will pay twice as much in future trade negotiations with the U.S. Listen in.
Spain's terrible what they've done. No, I do. They're the only country that won't pay the full up. They want to stay at 2%. I think it's terrible. And, you know, they're doing very well. The economy is very well. And that economy could be blown right out of the water with something bad happening. You know, Spain is the only country that... Are you from Spain?
Yeah.
Good, congratulations. You're the only country that is not paying. I don't know what the problem is. I think it's too bad. So we'll make it up. You know what we're going to do? We're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal. We're going to make them pay twice as much. And I'm actually serious about that.
And meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said NATO is now more lethal than ever, crediting the alliance's new defense spending commitment. He called the agreement a significant step in forward collective security. Here's what he had to say.
With the UK at the forefront, NATO allies have agreed a new defence investment pledge, raising defence and security spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. Making NATO stronger, fairer, and more lethal than ever. So under the NATO new definitions, we estimate that we will reach at least 4.1% of GDP in 2027, keeping the British people safe and strengthening our leadership in NATO even further.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky may have been largely sidelined during this year's NATO summit at The Hague, but he still secured a closed-door meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. Their 50-minute talk was cordial, with Trump later saying the talks couldn't have been nicer. No journalists were allowed into the room at the first encounter between the two leaders since they talked at the Vatican 2 months ago, but both Trump and Zelensky appeared to have avoided a repeat of the infamous Oval House bust-up that soured relations between Kyiv and it's been the key global backer. Moving on now, Tesla's new car sales in Europe nosedived nearly 28% in May, even as the broader electric vehicle segment grew over 27% year-on-year. The revamped Model Y from Tesla has yet to spark a turnaround for the automaker. Here's a report.
Tesla's new car sales in Europe fell just under 28% in May from a year earlier. That was despite sales of fully electric vehicles rising over 27% in the region. That's according to trade data released Wednesday by the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Tesla's European sales have now fallen for 5 straight months as customers switch to cheaper Chinese EVs. Some potential buyers have also protested against Tesla CEO Elon Musk's politics. Tesla's European market share dropped to just 1.2% in May from 1.8% a year ago. The US EV maker's revised Model Y has yet to show signs of reviving the brand's fortunes. It was aimed at revamping the company's aging model range, particularly when traditional automakers and Chinese rivals have launched EVs at a fast pace amid trade tensions. Chinese manufacturers kept up their strong growth in Europe last month despite EU tariffs on the country's EVs. They doubled market share to 5.9% according to separate data released Tuesday. BYD registered nearly as many vehicles as Tesla in May after outselling it in April.
And US President Donald Trump said on Wednesday that Washington will hold nuclear talks with Iran next week, hinting at the possibility of a deal even after, boasting that the recent US strikes crippled the Islamic Republic's atomic program. At the NATO summit in The Hague, Trump welcomed the swift cessation of hostilities between Iran and Israel, expressing hope for a renewed diplomatic path with Tehran, one that he says would prevent the regime from rebuilding its nuclear capabilities. Listen in.
U.S. President Donald Trump arrived at The Hague on Wednesday for a NATO summit, and he reveled in what he presented as his ability to reach a ceasefire in the recent conflict between Iran and Israel.
They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easy to stop them.
On June 13th, Israel launched a surprise attack on Iranian military, government, and suspected nuclear sites. Iran retaliated by launching ballistic missiles, some of which struck Israeli population centers. Trump joined the fight on Israel's side, targeting Iranian nuclear sites with huge bunker-busting bombs. He claimed that decision put an end to the fighting.
This ended that with a war. If we didn't take that out, they'd be fighting right now.
Both Iran and Israel declared victory after the ceasefire was announced. Israel claimed to have achieved its goals of destroying Iran's nuclear sites and missiles. Iran claimed to have forced the war to end by penetrating Israeli defenses. But the extent of the damage in Iran is uncertain. The U.S. dropped 30,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on the deeply buried Fordo uranium enrichment facility. An initial assessment by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency said Iran's path to building a nuclear weapon may have been set back only by months. Trump shrugged off that report, saying the findings were, quote, inconclusive, and that the targeted sites were destroyed.
We hear it was obliteration. It was a virtual obliteration.
We need to return.
Rafael Grossi, the head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog, said his top priority was ensuring international inspectors could return to Iran's nuclear sites. Grossi said whatever the damage, Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon remained.
What is clear is that, in any case, the technological knowledge is there and the industrial capacity is there that no one can deny.
And that the only long-term solution would be a diplomatic one.
The last thing they want to do is enrich anything right now. They want to recover.
Trump sounded optimistic that Iran would not continue to enrich uranium or pursue nuclear weapons.
We'll end up having somewhat of a relationship with Iran.
Now, staying with that story, the Director General of International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, Rafael Grossi, on Wednesday said that regaining access to Iran's nuclear facilities is now the nuclear watchdog's top priority. His statement follows Iran's parliament approving a measure to cut ties with IAEA, complicating inspections in the wake of military strikes by Israel and the U.S. Listen in to Rafael Grossi's statement.
So this is number one priority, like you say. We know that, I had received a letter from the Iranian foreign minister saying that they had taken protective measures already. They did not get into details into what that meant, but clearly that was the implicit meaning of that. So we can imagine that this material is there. So for that to confirm, for the whole situation to evaluate, we need to return. Of course, we have to recognize that there was a war, there was military action until yesterday. So there is, of course, common sense and dignity that we need to respect. But at the same time, we have said we need to return, we need to re-engage. And yesterday, I wrote a letter to Arakchi saying, well, let's meet to analyze the modalities.
U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell told the Congress on Wednesday that President Donald Trump's unprecedented tariff regime is making it challenging for the central bank to project inflation and determine when interest rate cuts may be appropriate. Listen in.
I think people look at the incidence of tariffs during the president's first term, but those were like 1/6 the size of what's people are estimating now. This is different. I think one of the reasons why it's so challenging is that there really isn't a modern precedent. And I think we have to be humble about our estimates. And we are very open to the possibility that transmission through into inflation will be less than we think, or maybe more than we think, which is why we're in a position of wanting to take our time and make a smart decision as we see how this unfolds.
Fed Reserve Jerome Powell there. Meanwhile, during a news conference on the sidelines of the NATO summit in The Hague, Trump called Fed Chair Jerome Powell terrible and said he knows 3 or 4 people who are contenders for the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Listen in.
I know within 3 or 4 people who are going to pick. I mean, he goes out pretty soon, fortunately, because I think he's terrible. We have no inflation. We have a tremendous economy. Hundreds of billions of dollars of tariff money is pouring in. Factories are being built because they don't want to pay the tariffs, so they're building them all over the country.
Well, at least 16 people were killed during nationwide protests in Kenya on Wednesday, most reportedly shot by police, according to Amnesty Kenya. The demonstrations come a year after similar unrest over a tax bill left more than 60 dead. Although last year's proposed tax hikes were dropped, frustration over heavy-handed policing has simmered following the death of a blogger this month while in custody. We have more details in this report.
Thousands of Kenyans took to the streets on Wednesday to mark the 1-year anniversary of deadly protests against a controversial tax bill. Some were hospitalized with gunshot wounds during rallies in Nairobi. It was not immediately clear who had shot them. Some protesters built barricades and others held up banners in the shape of hearts, roses, and white crosses. Police fired tear gas and water cannon to disperse crowds. They also blocked incoming traffic toward the central business district. Isolated clashes were reported in the port city of Mombasa.
Not have extrajudicial killings going on. We are losing people every day. It is becoming a massacre in Kenya.
As the protests widened to other towns, the Communications Authority of Kenya confirmed that it had ordered a halt to live broadcasts of the demonstrations. The demonstrations last year left at least 60 people dead and culminated in the storming of the National Parliament. Although the clashes faded after the bill was withdrawn, public anger over the use of excessive force continued to mount, with fresh protests this month over the death in police custody of blogger Albert Ojwang.
And that's all we have for you on this edition of the Morning Brief at 9. But news continues right here on News 9 after this short break. Stay tuned.
A deep dive into what matters to you the most. Angles you won't find anywhere else. News that impacts your life.
Every brand tells a story. They are the storytellers, the Sutradhars. They present a brand with band, baja and barat to you. They are the Brandwalas.
What is to the nines? In literal terms, it's perfection. But to us, it's not just a phrase, it's an attitude. One that starts at your desk and sends a statement to the world. To the nines is about taking charge. It's a way of life where every seam, every fold, is crafted with excellence. It's timeless elegance and uncompromising quality made for the corner office. It's the ideas that inspire redefining order and elevating the tabletop. To the nines, for the leaders of today and the visionaries of tomorrow.